I'd say that Saint-Saëns was a fascinating man, a fascinating composer, and just a fascinating figure in musical history. Of course, now we know him most as a composer, although we don't know him enough as a composer. But he was also an amazing pianist, very fine conductor. Apparently, Liszt said he was the greatest organist in Europe, which meant the world at that point. And then he was also an astronomer. He was a philosopher. He wrote books of philosophy, books of poetry. He wrote plays that were produced in Paris. He was an animal rights activist, travel writer, acoustics expert, and so on and so on. I mean, the man was just a phenomenon. I don't know how he managed to cram so much into his life. And he was an amazing child prodigy. I think at the age of 11, he gave his first recital, and then the little brat at the end asked the audience, he said, "Please name one of the Beethoven sonatas you'd like me to play as an encore, because I know them all." Revolting, really.
I think the thing that's amazing about Saint-Saëns is that he was born in 1835 and he died in 1921. And so he not only lived a really long time, but he also lived a really long time through an astonishing amount of change. He was born into a French musical world where the big figures were Hector Berlioz, Giacomo Meyerbeer. These were the guys dominating Paris at that time when Saint-Saëns was born in the 1830s. And by the time he dies, it's a musical world of Stravinsky, of Schoenberg, of Les Six, the Poulenc, Satie, etc., that so much has changed. And Saint-Saëns is a really important way of us understanding how you get from one to the other.
You know, he's very much involved in these societies for French music and promoting French music and, you know, encouraging others, not always, but he could be very encouraging to other composers, especially, of course, Fauré, who was his beloved student, became like a son to him, but also Ronaldo Al and others. He also promoted Liszt and Wagner in France, so he was never sort of blind nationalist.
He was a great patriot personally and also in musical terms, but at the same time, he was really open to international influences. He travelled regularly from his late 30s onwards to North Africa, to Egypt and Algeria in particular. He was, of course, a part of this Europe-wide movement that we would now call Orientalism, where he did travel and was inspired by, took ideas from the musics that he heard elsewhere. His song Danse Macabre was actually performed by some Algerian musicians before he turned it into a tone poem. And so he was really interested in speaking to the musicians in the places where he was staying.
So he had a lot of contacts around the world, and so some of his music is very exotic. There's sort of the Africa fantasy, the Egyptian concerto. His tentacles go everywhere. He was the first famous composer, anyway, to write for film. He wrote a hymn to electricity. So in that way, he was very forward-looking and very innovative.
At the very end of the century, he was appointed the general editor of a brand new edition of all of Rameau's work. So in that sense, he became practically involved in what we'd now think of as historically informed performance. But I think in all sorts of ways, this connected with Saint-Saëns' broader interests in archaeology, for instance. He was a tremendous polymath. He was clearly fascinated by history and by ancient history. And this was him acting as a kind of musical archaeologist. But then on the other hand, he was attuned to the idea of the music as a future as it became known. He was fascinated by the music of Wagner and by Liszt and by the new sounds that you could get from brand new instrumental technologies, valved brass, for instance. He wanted to use all those things. He really was this kind of melting pot for everything going on in 19th century music.
Of course, people know now the Swan. Some people know the Organ Symphony. There's not that much of his that is so regularly played, and that's really unfair because he's so prolific, but he's also so consistent as a composer. Well, he does vary, you know, he goes from really inspired to less inspired, but he's never less than good, and sometimes he's truly wonderful.
He was such an extraordinary musical thinker and such a sensitive musical listener, I think. The way he works with the materials that he's taking from a whole array of musics that he was interested in, a whole different array of influences, that what he creates is something truly brilliant. But the one thing he wasn't was an avant-garde composer. And that for so long now, we've valued the idea of originality that must break free of everything that's gone before it, above almost anything else. And I think Saint-Saëns is himself a fantastic reason to put that behind us.